Good evening, everyone. This is Kat, and hopefully some of you recognize this music. This is the official theme song of Hercule Poirot, a detective in a very famous series by the author Agatha Christie. I am having a very boring night tonight. For those of you who know, I've been sick the last several days, and apologies if you can hear an clicking sound in the background. That's my mask currently. I'm trying to adjust the volume here of the music. I've decided to just do something random and read a story. Just because I don't really have much else to do when my brain is one of those that can't let me sleep, no matter how terrible I feel, once it gets going. So yeah, don't bother worrying about waiting for any images to come on the screen. It's really just going to be my voice, talking, so you're free to look up whatever internet forums you want to go to. This is the tale of The Mysterious Mr. Quin by Agatha Christie, and I'm probably not going to make it through the entire chapter tonight. Again, I'm sick, and this is probably going to be hard on my voice, just doing this once. I do a lot of random things, so if you guys like this, who knows, maybe I'll continue reading. Anyway, here we go. Chapter 1, The Coming of Mr. Quin. It was New Year's Eve. The elder members of the house party at Royston were assembled in the big hall. Mr. Satterthwaite was glad that the young couple had gone to bed. He was not fond of young people in herds. He thought them uninteresting and crude. They lacked subtlety, and his life went he had become increasingly fond of subtleties. Mr. Satterthwaite was 62, a little bent, dried-up man with a peering face oddly elf-like, and an intense and inordinate interest in other people's lives. All his life, so to speak, he had sat in the front row of the stalls, watching various dramas of human nature unfold before him. His role had always been that of the onlooker. Only now, with old age holding him in its clutch, he found himself increasingly critical of the drama submitted to him. He demanded now something a little out of the common. There was no doubt that he had a flair for these things. He knew instinctively when the element of drama was at hand. Like a warhorse, he sniffed the scent. Since his arrival at Royston this afternoon, that strange inner sense of his had stirred and bid him be ready. Something interesting was happening or going to happen soon. The house party was not a large one. There was Tom Evesham, the genial, good-humoured host, and his serious political wife, who had been before her marriage Lady Laura Quin. There was Sir Richard Conway, soldier, traveller, and sportsman. There were 6 or 7 young people, whose names Mr. Satterthwaite had not grasped, and there were the Portals. It was the Portals who interested Mr. Satterthwaite. He had never met Alec Portal before, but he knew all about him. He had known his father and his grandfather. Alec Portal ran pretty true to the type. He was a man of close on 40, fair-haired and blue-eyed like all the Portals. Fond of sport, good at games, but sadly devoid of imagination. Nothing unusual about Alec Portal, the usual good, sound English stock. But his wife was different. She was, Mrs. Satterthwaite knew, an Australian. Portal had been out in Australia 2 years ago, had met her out there, and had married her and brought her home. She had never been to England previous to her marriage. All the same, she wasn't at all like any other Australian woman Mr. Satterthwaite had met. He observed her now covertly. Interesting woman, very so still, and yet so alive. Alive. That was just it. Not exactly beautiful, no. You wouldn't call her beautiful, but there was a kind of calamitous magic about her that you couldn't miss, that no man could miss. The masculine side of Mr. Satterwhite spoke there, but the feminine side, for Mrs. Satterwhite had a large share of femininity, was equally interested in another question. Why did Miss Portal dye her hair? No other man would probably have known that she dyed her hair, but Mrs. Satterwhite knew. He knew all those things, and it puzzled him. Many dark women dye their hair blonde. He had never before come across a fair woman who dyed her hair black. Everything about her intrigued him, in a queer, intuitive way. He felt certain that she was either very happy or very unhappy, but he didn't know which, and it annoyed him not to know. Furthermore, there was a curious effect she had upon her husband. He adores her, said Mr. Satterwhite to himself. But sometimes he's, yes, afraid of her. That was very interesting. Uncommonly interesting. Portal drank too much, that was certain, and he had a curious way of watching his wife when she wasn't looking. Nerves, said Mrs. Satterwhite. The fellow's all nerves. She knows it too, but she won't do anything about it. He felt very curious about the pair of them. Something was going on that he couldn't fathom. He was roused from his meditations on the subject by the solemn chiming of a big clock. 12 o'clock, said Evesham. New Year's Day. Happy New Year, everybody. As a matter of fact, the clock's 5 minutes fast. I don't know why the children wouldn't wait up and see the New Year in. I don't suppose for a minute they've really gone to bed, said his wife placidly. They're probably putting hairbrushes or something in our beds. That sort of thing does so amuse them. I can't think why. We should never have been allowed to do such a thing in my young day. Autre temps, autre mœurs, said Conway, smiling. And apologies to anyone out there who speaks French. I am, just as a side note, still learning it myself. I probably just butchered that. He was a tall, soldierly-looking man. Both he and Evesham were much of the same type. Honest, upright, kindly men with no great pretensions to brains. In my young days, we all joined hands in a circle and sang Auld Lang Syne, continued Lady Laura. Should old acquaintance be forgot? So touching, I always think the words are. Evesham moved uneasily. Oh, drop it, Laura, he muttered. Not here. He strode across the wide hall where they were sitting and switched on an extra light. Very stupid of me, said Lady Laura, sotto voce. Reminds me of poor Mr. Capel, of course. My dear, is the fire too hot for you? Eleanor Portal had made a brusque movement. Thank you, I'll move my chair back a little. What a lovely voice she had, one of those low, murmuring, echoing voices that stay in your memory, thought Mrs. Satterwhite. Her face was in shadow now, what a pity. From her place in the shadow she spoke again. Mr. Capel? Yes? The man who originally owned this house. He shot himself, you know. Oh, very well, Tom dear. I won't speak of it unless you like. It was a great shock for Tom, of course, because he was here when it happened. So, weren't you, Sir Richard? So were you, weren't you, Sir Richard? Yes, Lady Laura. An old grandfather clock in the corner groaned, wheezed, snorted asthmatically, and then struck 12. Happy New Year, grunted Evesham perfunctorily. Ugh. Who says that word anymore? Lady Laura wound up her knitting with some deliberation. Well, we've seen the New Year in, she observed and added, looking toward Mrs. Portal. What do you think, my dear? Eleanor Portal rose quickly to her feet. Bed, by all means, she said lightly. She's very pale, thought Mrs. Satterwhite, as he too rose and began busying himself with candlesticks. She's not usually as pale as that, he mused to himself as he observed her. He lighted her candle and handed it to her with a funny little old-fashioned bow. She took it from him with a word of acknowledgement and went slowly up the stairs. Suddenly, a very odd impulse swept over Mrs. Satterwhite. He wanted to go after her. To reassure her, he had the strangest feeling that she was in danger of some kind. The impulse died down and he felt ashamed. He was getting nervy too. Yeah, sorry, the music stopped. One moment, please. She hadn't looked at her husband as he went up the stairs, but now she turned her head over her shoulder and gave him a long, searching glance which had a queer intensity in it. It affected Mr. Satterwhite very oddly as he viewed it. He found himself saying good-night to his hostess in quite a flustered manner. "I'm sure I hope it will be a Happy New Year," Lady Laura was saying, "but the political situation seems to me to be fraught with grave uncertainty." "I'm sure it is," said Mrs. Satterwhite earnestly. "I'm sure it is." "I only hope," continued Lady Laura, without the least change of manner, "that it will be the dark man who first crosses the threshold. You know that superstition, I suppose, Mrs. Satterwhite? No? You surprised me. To bring good luck to the house, it must be a dark man who first steps over the doorstep on New Year's Day. Dear me, I hope I shan't find anything very unpleasant in my bed. I never trust the children. They have such very high spirits." Shaking her head in sad foreboding, Lady Laura moved majestically up the staircase. With the departure of the women, chairs were pulled in closer around the blazing logs on the big open hearth. "Say when," said Evesham hospitably as he held up the whiskey decanter. When everybody had said when, the talk reverted to the subject which had been tabooed before. "You knew Derek Capel, did you, Satterwhite?" asked Conway. "Slightly, yes." "And you, Portal?" "No, I never met him." So fiercely and defensively did he say it that Mrs. Satterwhite looked up in surprise. "I always hate it when Laura brings up the subject," said Evesham slowly. "After the tragedy, you know, this place was sold to a big manufacturer fellow. He cleared out after a year. Didn't suit him or something. A lot of tommy rot was talked about the place being haunted, of course, and I gave the house a bad name. Then, when Laura got me to stand for West Kittleby, of course it meant living up in these parts, and it wasn't so easy to find a suitable house. Royston was going cheap, and well, in the end I bought it. Ghosts are all tommy rot, but all the same one doesn't exactly care to be reminded that you're living in a house where one of your own friends shot himself. Poor old Derek, we shall never know why he did it." "He won't be the first or the last fellow who shot himself without being able to give a reason," said Alec Portal heavily. He rose and poured himself out another drink, splashing the whiskey in with a liberal hand. "There's something very wrong with him," said Mrs. Satterwhite to himself. "Very wrong indeed. I wish I knew what it was all about." "God," said Conway, "listen to the wind. It's a wild night." "A good night for ghosts to walk," said Portal with a reckless laugh. "All the devils in hell are abroad tonight." "According to Lady Laura, even the blackest of them would bring us luck," observed Conway with a laugh. "Hark to that." The wind rose in another terrific wail, and as it died away, there came 3 loud knocks on the big nailed doorway. Ugh. Everyone started. "Who on earth can that be at this time of night?" cried Evesham. They stared at each other. "I will open it," said Evesham. "The servants have gone to bed." He strode across to the door, fumbled a little over the heavy bars, and finally flung it open. An icy blast of wind came sweeping into the hall. Framed in the doorway stood a man's figure, tall and slender. To Mr. Satterwhite, watching, he appeared, by some curious effect of the stained glass above the door, to be dressed in every color of the rainbow. Then, as he stepped forward, he showed himself to be a thin, dark man. "I must really apologize for this intrusion," said the stranger in a pleasant, level voice. "But my car broke down. Nothing much. My chauffeur is putting it to rights, but it will take half an hour or so, and it is so confoundedly cold outside." He broke off, and Evesham took up the thread quickly. "I should think it was. Come in and have a drink. We can't give you any assistance about the car, can we?" "No, thanks. My man knows what to do. By the way, my name is Quin. Harley Quin." "Sit down, Mr. Quin," said Evesham. "Sir Richard Conway, Mr. Satterwhite, Mr. Portal, my name is Evesham." Mr. Quin acknowledged the introductions and dropped into the chair that Evesham had hospitably pulled forward. As he sat, some effect of the firelight threw a bar of shadow across his face, which gave almost the impression of a mask. Evesham threw a couple more logs on the fire. "A drink? Thanks." Evesham brought it to him and asked as he did so, "Do you know this part of the world well, Mr. Quin?" "I passed through it some years ago." "Really?" "Yes, this house belonged then to a man called Capel." "Ah, yes," said Evesham. "Poor Derek Capel. You knew him?" "Yes, I knew him." Evesham's manner underwent a faint change, almost imperceptible to one who had not studied the English character. Before it had contained a subtle reserve. Now this was laid aside. Mr. Quin had known Derek Capel. He was a friend of a friend, and as such was vouched for and fully accredited. "Astounding affair, that," he said confidently. "We were just talking about it. I can tell you, it went against the grain buying this place. If there had been anything else suitable, but there wasn't. You see, I was in the house the night he shot himself. So was Conway here, and upon my word, I've always expected his ghost to walk." "A very inexplicable business," said Mr. Quin slowly and deliberately, and he paused in the air of an actor who had just spoken an important cue. "You may well say inexplicable," burst in Conway. "The thing's a black mystery. Always will be." "I wonder," said Mr. Quin noncommittally. "Yes, Sir Richard, you were saying?" "Astounding, that's what it was. Here's a man in the prime of life, gay, light-hearted, without a care in the world. 5 or 6 old pals staying with him, top of his spirits at dinner, full of plans for the future. And from the dinner table he goes straight upstairs to his room, takes a revolver from a drawer, and shoots himself. Why? Nobody ever knew. Nobody ever will know." "Isn't that rather a sweeping statement, Sir Richard?" asked Mr. Quin, smiling, almost Cheshirely. Conway stared at him. "What do you mean? I don't understand." "A problem is not necessarily unsolvable because it has remained unsolved." "Oh, come on. If nothing came out at the time, it's not likely to come out now, 10 years afterward." Mr. Quin shook his head gently. "I disagree with you. The evidence of history is against you. The contemporary historian never writes such a true history as the historian of a later generation. It is a question of getting the true perspective, of seeing things in proportion. If you like to call it so, it is, like everything else, a question of relativity." Alec Porter leaned forward. his face twitching painfully. "You're right, Mr. Quin," he cried. "You're right. Time does not dispose of a question. It only presents it anew in a different guise." Evesham was smiling tolerantly. "Then you mean to say, Mr. Quin, that if we were to hold, let us say, a court of inquiry tonight into the circumstances of Derek Capel's death, we are as likely to arrive at the truth as we should have been at the time?" "More likely, Mr. Evesham. The personal equation has largely dropped out, and you will remember facts as facts without seeking to put your own interpretation upon them." Evesham frowned doubtfully. "One must have a starting point, of course," said Mr. Quin in his quiet, level voice. "A starting point is usually a theory. One of you must have a theory, I am sure. How about you, Sir Richard?" Conway frowned thoughtfully. "Well, of course," he said apologetically. "We all thought, that there must be a woman in it somewhere. It's usually either that or money, isn't it?" And it certainly wasn't money. No trouble of that description. So what else could it have been? Mr. Satterwhite started. He had leaned forward to contribute a small remark of his own, and in the act of doing so, he had caught sight of a woman's figure crouched against the balustrade of the gallery above. She was huddled down against it, invisible from everywhere but where he himself sat, and she was evidently listening with strained attention to what was going on below. So immovable was she that he hardly believed the evidence of his own eyes. But he recognized the pattern of the dress easily enough. An old-world brocade, worn by one of the women from earlier tonight. It was Eleanor Portal. And suddenly, all the events of the night seemed to fall into pattern. Mr. Quin's arrival, no fortuitous chance, but the appearing of an actor when his own cue was given. There was a drama being played in the big hall at Royston tonight. A drama none the less real in that one of the actors was dead. Oh, yes, Derek Capel had a part in the play. Mr. Satterwhite was sure of that. And again, suddenly, a new illumination came to him. This was Mr. Quin's doing. It was he who was staging the play, was giving the actors their cues. He was at the heart of this mystery, pulling the strings, making the puppets work. He knew everything, even to the presence of the woman crouched against the woodwork upstairs. Yes, he knew now. Sitting well back in his chair, secure in his role of an audience, Mrs. Satterwhite watched the drama unfold before his eyes. Quietly and naturally, Mr. Quin was pulling the strings, setting his puppets in motion. A woman, yes, he murmured thoughtfully. There was no mention of any woman at dinner. Why, of course, cried Evesham. He announced his engagement. That's just what made it seem so absolutely mad. Very bucked about it, he was. Said it wasn't to be announced just yet, but gave us the hint that he was in the running for the Benedict stakes. Of course, we all guessed who the lady was, said Conway. Marjorie Dilke. Nice girl. It seemed to be Mr. Quin's turn to speak, but he did not do so, and something about his silence seemed oddly provocative. It was as though he challenged the last statement. It had the effect of putting Conway in a defensive position. Who else could it have been, Evesham? I don't know, said Tom Evesham slowly. What did he say exactly now? Something about being in the running for the Benedict stakes. That he couldn't tell us the lady's name till he had her permission. It wasn't to be announced yet, he said. I remember that he was a damned lucky fellow. That he wanted his two old friends to know that by the time next year he'd be a happy married man. Of course, we assumed it was Marjorie. They were great friends, and he'd been about with her a lot. The only thing, began Conway and stopped. What were you going to say, Dick? Well, I mean, it was odd in a way, if it was Marjorie, that the engagement shouldn't be announced at once. I mean, Why the secrecy? Sounds more as though it were a married woman, you know, someone whose husband had just died or who was divorcing him. That's true, said Evesham. If that were the case, of course, the engagement couldn't be announced at once. And you know, thinking back about it, I don't believe he had been seeing much of Marjorie. All that was the year before. I remember thinking things seemed to have cooled off between them. Curious, said Mr. Quin, his hands steepled as he sat in a chair. Yes, looked almost as though someone had come between them. Another woman, said Conway thoughtfully. By Jove, said Evesham. You know, there was something almost indecently hilarious about old Derek that night. He looked almost drunk with happiness, and yet I can't quite explain what I mean. But he looked oddly defiant, too. Like a man defying fate, said Alec Portal heavily. Was it of Derek Capel he was speaking of, or was it of himself? Mr. Satterthwaite looked at him, inclined to the latter view. Yes, that was what Alec Portal represented, a man defying fate. His imagination, muddled by drink, responded suddenly to the note in the story which recalled his own secret preoccupation. Mrs. Satterthwaite looked up. She was still there, watching, listening, still motionless and frozen, like a dead woman. Perfectly true, said Conway. Capel was excited, curiously so. I describe him as a man who has staked heavily and won against well-nigh overwhelming odds. Getting up courage, perhaps, for what he's made up his mind to do, suggested Portal. And as though moved by an association of ideas, he got up and helped himself to another drink. Not a bit of it, said Evesham sharply. I'd almost swear nothing of that kind was in his mind. Conway's right. A successful gambler who has brought off a long shot and can hardly believe in his own good fortune. That was the attitude he had that night. Conway gave a gesture of discouragement, and yet he said 10 minutes later. We sat in silence. Evesham brought his hand down with a bang on the table. Something must have happened in that 10 minutes, he cried. It must, but what? Let's go over it carefully. We were all talking. In the middle of it, Capel got up suddenly and left the room. Why? Said Mr. Quin. The interruption seemed to disconcert Evesham. I beg your pardon? I only said why, said Mr. Quin. Evesham frowned in an effort of memory. It didn't seem vital at the time. Oh, of course, the post. Don't you remember that jangling bell? And how excited we were? We'd been snowed up for 3 days, remember? Biggest snowstorm for years and years. All the roads were impassable. No newspapers, no letters. Capel went out to see if something had come through at last and got a great pile of things. Newspapers and letters. He opened the paper to see if there was any news, and then went upstairs with his letters. 3 minutes afterward we heard a shot. Inexplicable. Absolutely inexplicable. That's not inexplicable, said Portal. Of course the fellow got some unexpected news in a letter. Obvious, I should have said. I don't think we missed anything so obvious as that. It was one of the coroner's first questions, but Capel never opened one of his letters. The whole pile lay unopened on his dressing table. Portal looked crestfallen. You're sure he didn't open just one of them? He might have destroyed it after reading it? No, I'm quite positive. Of course, that would have been the natural solution. No, every one of the letters was unopened. Nothing burned, nothing torn up. There was no fire in the room. Portal shook his head. Extraordinary. It was a ghastly business altogether, said Evesham in a low voice. Conway and I went up when we heard the shot and found him. It gave me a shock, I can tell you.